Halls had always believed that work was just work. Fix the cracks, replace the locks, get paid, and leave. No attachments, no questions. That belief carried him through years of restoring old houses and forgotten buildings, most of them abandoned by time and by people with more stories than they'd ever dare to tell. He liked the solitude that came with his job. No one around, no conversations to fill the silence, just the sound of his tools biting into wood and metal. It was a damp Wednesday when the call came. A property manager from a town Halls had barely heard of was asking if he could look at an old boarding house, long since out of service. There was a single locked room that no one had been able to open in years. The building's new owners wanted to convert the place into a small hotel, but they couldn't do anything until that room was dealt with. Halls agreed, mostly because the pay was good. He packed up his tools, drove through the thinning evening light, and arrived just as the sun dipped behind the hills. The boarding house was 3 stories tall, a weathered brick shell standing at the end of a forgotten street. Its windows were dusty and opaque, and the front door hung open as though the building itself were exhaling. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mold and wood rot. Wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, and the floorboards groaned with every step. Halls found the locked door at the end of the second-floor hallway. It looked unremarkable. Paint chipped, handle tarnished, but there was something about it that made him pause. He ran his fingers along the frame. The wood felt damp and strangely cold, as though the room beyond was holding its own weather. Halls set his toolbox down, took out a crowbar, and wedged it between the door and the frame. With a grunt, he forced the latch, and the door swung inward with a groan. The room was empty. A single window let in a thin beam of gray light, illuminating walls stained with water damage. There was nothing else. No furniture, no personal belongings, no evidence that anyone had ever lived there. Yet Halls felt the weight of the air settle around him, dense and still. He stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly, prickling the hairs on his arms. On the far wall, faint scratches marred the plaster, a chaotic web of lines etched deep enough to expose the wooden slats beneath. Halls leaned closer. They weren't random, more like frantic, repeated claw marks, as if someone had tried desperately to dig their way out. A shiver worked its way up his spine. He told himself it was just another abandoned room. People did strange things, especially in places like this. He turned back, closed the door behind him, and got to work removing the old hinges. That night, Halls returned to his motel. He tossed his tools into the corner and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. He woke to the sensation of pressure on his hands, like someone gripping them tightly. In the dark, he couldn't see anything, but the feeling was so vivid he gasped. When he turned on the light, his palms were marked with thin red indentations, as though fingernails had dug into his skin. He laughed it off. He'd been working with rough wood and old metal all day. Maybe had done it to himself without realizing. He washed his hands, climbed back into bed, and tried to sleep again. But the next morning, the marks were deeper, and they were in both hands now. Halls returned to the boarding house the following afternoon. He told himself he had a job to finish. Yet as he climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, an unfamiliar anxiety coiled in his gut. The door he'd opened yesterday was ajar, yawning like an open mouth. Inside, the air felt even heavier. Halls retrieved his flashlight and swept the beam across the walls. The scratches were still there, but now they seemed sharper, fresher. He crouched to inspect them, running his fingers along the grooves. They were deeper than he remembered, and the wood at the base was splintered, as though the clawing had happened recently. A sudden creak behind him made Halls whirl around. The door had swung shut on its own. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and yanked it open. The hallway beyond was empty, but the brief moment of isolation had left him rattled, his pulse pounding in his ears. That evening, Halls called the property manager. "Hey, about that room," he began. "What's the story here? Anyone tell you why it was locked up in the first place?" There was a pause. "All I know," the manager said finally, "is that the last tenant disappeared. Room stayed sealed ever since. Locals say it's cursed. Honestly, I didn't think you'd get it open." Halls forced a laugh. "Yeah, well, it's open now." The dreams started that night. He found himself standing in the same room, walls pulsing like they were breathing. Scratches crept across the plaster as though invisible hands were clawing from within. And always, just at the edge of hearing, a voice whispered, "I can't get out. Let me out." Halls woke drenched in sweat, the words echoing in his mind. His hands throbbed. Under the harsh light of the motel lamp, the scratches on his palms had deepened, the thin lines now breaking the skin. Over the next few days, Halls's condition worsened. The scratches spread up his arms, angry welts that burned like fresh cuts. He started losing track of time, waking up in unfamiliar positions. His tools moved without explanation. Every time he closed his eyes, the room was there, empty, suffocating, and waiting. He returned to the boarding house, determined to finish the job and put the whole thing behind him. The door hung crooked on its frame now, the hinges already removed. Halls stepped inside and felt the temperature drop to a biting cold. For the first time, he spoke into the empty room. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was absolute. Then, so softly he almost thought he imagined it. "You opened the door. Now you have to stay." Panic surged through Halls. He stumbled back toward the doorway, but the hall beyond seemed to stretch away into darkness, impossibly long. He bolted through, running until his lungs burned, only to find himself standing in the same room, the same scratches waiting on the walls. The realization hit him like ice water. He hadn't left. Days blurred together. Halls tried everything, breaking the window, tearing at the door, even smashing through the walls. But every attempt led him back to the center of the room, breathless and bleeding. His hands were raw, his nails chipped and broken from clawing at the unyielding surfaces. When exhaustion finally forced him to sleep, the whispers returned, closer now, more insistent. "You opened it. You let me out. Now you're mine." No one heard from Halls after that. Weeks later, when the property manager finally returned, the boarding house was as he'd left it, dusty, silent, and abandoned. The second-floor room was locked once more. On the far wall, beneath layers of old scratches, fresh lines were gouged deep into the plaster. They formed a single word, etched in shaky, desperate strokes. HALS.